going to be recording this. Good morning, hi. As the title says, this presentation is about measuring fluctuations and changes over time, and specifically what I'm going to talk a lot about is collecting and analyzing intensive longitudinal data. There's a QR code for the slides. It'll also be there at the end. Part of what I want with this presentation is just to give you a lot of resources so that there's a lot of references and some books at the end, so you can always take the slides and then find all those resources later. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, so my name is Annelise Blanchard. I did my PhD here at UC Louvain. I'm now doing a postdoc between here and KU Leuven. And my background is in psychology, so a lot of what I talk about here will be from the perspective of a psychology background. And there's some things where that really informs how I understand collecting this type of data. And I want to know a little bit about y'all, so since there's only 4 of y'all. If you would all be okay just saying maybe your name, your discipline, if that's easy enough, and also if you've ever heard the term experience sampling or intensive longitudinal data before. Do you want me to use a mic? It's possible. So if you're okay then with your voice being on the recording.
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Sofia Pagliarin, and I am a researcher at Erasmus University Rotterdam. I have not heard the specific terms, but I also work with time and the time dimension with QCA specifically. Therefore, I would like to know more about your approach.
Good.
Thank you.
Good to know. Let's see. I'll take it back then. Thank you.
Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Ali. I come from Austria. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Salzburg. I have some experience working with panel data. I think that's also kind of longitudinal data. And I'm really interested to learn more about techniques and tricks that we can use. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Chantry, and I'm a PhD student at UC Louvain in public health. And I've heard very broadly about longitudinal data, but I'm involved in a research project where we will have to do longitudinal data, so I'm looking forward to hear you.
Hi, my name is Bernd Weiß. I'm with GESES, Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences. I'm head of a survey collection infrastructure, and we recently started to also collect what we call digital behavioral data. Sometimes it's also known as digital trace data. And as part of this endeavor, we are collecting web tracking data. That is what I will be talking tomorrow about briefly. But we also started building our own app. So I have some experience with experience sampling data. And I'm just more interested in learning more about the topic because I'm a survey researcher by heart, but I'm getting into this new field. Thank you.
Nice. So I hope I'll come get the mic. I hope it'll be something interesting and useful for all of you. I do, for myself, come more from a survey background, so hopefully that perspective will be helpful. And for everyone else, I hope it's a nice introduction. If you have any questions, I am fine if you interrupt me. I'll just maybe rephrase the question then for the camera. But I tried to make it so that it's very clear no matter the background, but again, because I have this psychology background and my PhD was focused on this topic, it could be that there's things that you don't understand that I hadn't realized. So the goals today, I'll talk a little bit about the terminology and history. I'll talk a lot about the data collection methods, and I'll really zoom in on self-report methods because that's what my background and expertise is in. And I'll also talk a little bit about the different platforms that can be used to collect this type of data. I'll talk a little bit about pre-processing and analyses, and especially where you can get resources for these. So we'll go ahead and get started now. So experience sampling methodology is one of the main terms used for this in psychology research. The main thing is that it's really about people's experience in everyday life. So this is a recent definition, structured self-report daily diary techniques, assessing mood, symptoms, context, and appraisals thereof as they occur in daily life. So in psychology, the focus is really on what's happening in participants' daily lives as the participants themselves are reporting typically. And so the focus is really on having many assessments. So it's longitudinal data, but it's really closely, like the time dimension is really closely or micro level. So sometimes many times a day or once a day, but for weeks or months. And the idea is really to have an insight into participants' daily lives so that they're not coming into the lab or they're not maybe doing one questionnaire at some point, but they're really in the middle of their life answering these questions to have a little bit more insight about what's going on in their real life experience. It's also the idea of complexity of environment. So especially from psychology, it was typically more to do some kind of lab experiments where you're controlling everything. Except for maybe one stimuli. And here the idea instead, good morning, come in, good morning. By the way, just so you'll know, I'll have QR codes with slides at the end, so if there's anything resources that you want, and feel free to interrupt me if you have questions at any point. So another big aspect is to look at the complexity of environment. So for psychology, this was contrasted to the lab environment. And through this, to look at really naturally occurring changes. So instead of controlling everything in a lab, really looking at people are in different contexts every day, so how might things change from one context to the next, or if they have some kind of big event that's a change in their life, how might that change maybe their experiences, their emotions, and so on. And one way to think of this is really a snapshot, so that we're getting many snapshots over time of people's experiences. It's not as rich as, say, a video of their life. We're still missing a lot of information and a lot of data, but it's more information than we would get just from one questionnaire, or at least we're trying to piece together into this long series of snapshots. Good morning. So this is one of the very first studies that was done that used this term experience sampling and used this method. And by the way, so we'll have the QR code at the end with the slides for the people that just came in. So here, this was someone in the 70s where they were really interested in teenagers' lives, and so they sent booklets for teenagers to fill out every day or many times a day about their mood, their focus, self-consciousness, sense of skill, challenge, and control, and to fill these out in different environments. And then they looked at, in these different environments, what were the differences in how these teenagers felt. So it was a way to really look in people's daily lives about how they're experiencing different contexts differently at this time in the 1970s. Then, in the 1990s, this kind of method was used again here more with things like smoking, so really looking at urges, looking at behaviors, and looking at context. So if someone's smoking a cigarette, are there specific contexts that it's more linked with? Are they doing it after urges? Or is there specific links that the urges have to different things? And there was also, the same lab looked a lot at chronic pain. So when different people are feeling pain, how it's evolving over time, if it's linked with specific, again, context or other variables. And this lab called this ecological momentary assessment. So the idea is still the same, that you're asking people many times, so many times a day or once a day, but over weeks or months. But it's ecological, so here the idea is, again, it's in people's daily lives. There's also been the term used ambulatory assessment. So this is more used maybe in medical context. It's a very similar idea, just there's a lot of different terms used in the literature. And for me, the term that kind of encapsulates all of this, which was in the title, is intensive longitudinal data. And so this last term especially encompasses not just active forms, so really people self-reporting about what they're experiencing, but also maybe more passive forms of data collection, which I'll talk about more in a bit. So at the very start, this was really pen and paper questionnaires that you were maybe mailing to participants. They were filling out many times over a few weeks, and then they would mail back to you. Now we have phones, so this type of data collection method is much easier. It's also become a lot more prevalent because usually people can just use their own phones. There's apps that you can use to prompt participants to answer questions, also through some web pages. There's different ways to do it. But it doesn't just have to be participants answering questions. It could also be them recording something. So, for example, I have colleagues in the Netherlands that have had participants record after a conflict with a partner, how they felt and what they did after the conflict, so that it could be easier, either if participants don't want to write out something or don't want to answer numerical questions, but also just a different way to collect data. Similarly, you could have participants take pictures, maybe of the different environments they're in or of environments they find meaningful or something else, or audio or video record different things about their lives. And when these kinds of methods were first being used in psychology, so in the 70s and 90s, people were really worried that this was way too intrusive into people's lives. How can we ask them to write something every day about themselves, to take pictures? And that idea has really changed just because now people do document their lives for themselves via blogs and vlogs and a lot of other things. So that part, there's a lot of participants or people in general that are very willing also for research to share different parts of their lives, to document it via their phone. So this is the more active type of data, so where participants are really themselves answering questions or taking some kind of data collection. But there's also a lot of passive forms of data collection, so where the participants themselves are not choosing what to record or when to record it. So for example, again, with voice or pictures or cameras, these can all be collected without the participant choosing when it's happening. I have a colleague at KU Leuven who collects snippets of when people are speaking and analyzes them for emotion words and emotion tones. I've also heard of some research labs in the US where people will wear a little camera around like a necklace, and it'll take pictures of their environment to have an idea either of just environments in general or maybe green spaces versus other spaces. And also I've heard of labs that have done a similar thing, but where they record videos to really get an idea of their participants' commuting time, I think, or how they're commuting to work. This, of course, involves a lot more ethical considerations because the participants are not choosing what data is getting collected. They're not choosing what they can respond. So a lot of times in any case with GDPR, this means that the participant should be aware that data is being collected, so that, for example, they're being recorded. On a phone, it can be with a light that's turned on, same with a little camera. But it also involves the participant being aware that they can ask for some of their data to be removed, so that they could ask afterwards, or like for certain days they don't want the data to be used anymore. And in general, it just involves a lot of conversations with participants about what they feel comfortable with, what they're okay with. So it's a very interesting type of data, but does involve more ethical considerations, I would say. You can also track participants' GPS via their phone, usually. Again, maybe to see if they're in different aspects, different parts of a city, or in more like a forested part versus a city part, or many other research questions. You could more sense what types of, like for example, things they're doing on their phone. So if it's more like scrolling on social media, or which different apps they're using. This could be very broad, just if they're on their phone at all, but it could be very targeted. So really looking at different times and different apps and what they're doing in different apps. And also, it can be something like wearables, so some type usually of wristwatch, so that participants can wear it in their daily life. It's not that annoying to them, but that it can measure different types of physiological data. So for example, steps or some type of movement, some type of heart rate estimate, some type of sleep-wake cycle. Usually if it's on a wristwatch, it's not as accurate as other measures in the lab, but it at least allows an estimate. And for a lot of participants, they're maybe already wearing some kind of Google Watch or Apple Watch, and so they don't mind doing this. So this is just an idea of the types of data. Basically, it's very expansive, and the main thing that they have in common is it's really finely grained temporal data. So you're really looking at, in time, many, many time points. And here are some platforms. So I tried to put mainly platforms that people are pretty sure they'll last pretty long in time, so that they have a maybe a company or something else behind it where it doesn't seem like it'll crumble. Formar, however, is the exception. That's one that I use in my PhD. I mainly put it there because it's the only free option, and that's also why I used it. So that one takes a lot of R coding, and it takes a lot more work, but I do share the templates of what I had done for my studies. But some of the other ones that are interesting is Empath I have used as well. It's created by some colleagues at KU Leuven. And they're constantly integrating new things you can do with it. I think now there is, for example, passive phone sensing of what apps people are using. MovieSens, a lot of people use if they want really intensive physiological data, because it also sells sensors, including things like wristwatches, but maybe more complicated sensors, like some that participants, a strap they could wear around their chest for a really good measure of heart rate variability for people that would be interested. This is just mainly, though, to share some platforms with y'all. So in psychology, in the realms that I'm familiar with, most of this is quantitative data. But there's a lot of also qualitative data that falls under this rubric. For example, if people are writing diaries, that is intensive longitudinal data. So it's data that is really fine-grained in time. And this is a really great book that kind of talks about all of the history of this in different disciplines and discusses different possibilities. But for example, a historian who's interested in diaries from a specific person or a specific time point and is analyzing those, that falls under intensive longitudinal data. And they can be using all kinds of different methods of analysis, which could be very traditional qualitative methods, but also looking at how something is changing over time. But they could also be using maybe some of these other methods that are discussed, more quantitative methods as well, if they wanted to. So now I'm going to talk about more the quantitative side, because that is what I have more background in. So the idea in psychology, especially now, is that you're prompting participants to answer questions many times in their daily life. So maybe many times a day or once a day over many weeks. So this could be about their thoughts or feelings. For example, this is a screenshot from the study that I did during my PhD with parents. So parents would answer a question such as, I felt exhausted while caring for my children. It was on a slider scale. Could also be about their emotions at different times. This is a GIF from Empath. So the participants can answer here, for example, which emotions they're feeling at that time. Could also be about different behaviors. So maybe if they are, when they are smoking or when they are eating, or all different types of behaviors that they could just note something, or check a box, for example. Could also be about the context, so social, physical context. This is an example, it's a little small on the screen, but it says I am currently at, and there's different boxes. It could be home, work, on the way, other, just to have an idea of context. And different things like different sensations. So it could be pain. So here, this is a person would click on the places where they feel pain in their body. This is also a gift from Empath. So this is just to show you that the types of data that can be collected is very broad. And for research questions, this type of data is really intensive, especially if the participants are actively reporting different things about their experiencing in daily life. So it is important to balance that, where it should be used for research questions where that's really the main type of data suitable to answer the research question. Or you could look at people maybe that have shared similar types of data online, especially since this data is hard to collect. A lot more people are putting their anonymized data in repositories online, or if it's more qualitative data, looking in archives, depending on what the research question is. But for maybe just a minute, I would like y'all to think about in your own field, if you do have a research question that comes to mind easily with this type of intensive longitudinal data that would answer really well a research question that you would have. And I'll give you just 30 seconds a minute to think about that. Move on then to talking about different types of research questions that can make sense for this type of data. So one is tracking change or evolution. So for example, with some type of medical symptoms, it could be really useful to know when exactly the symptoms are maybe getting worse or getting better. So even if for a long part of the data they're not really changing, this still could be a very useful time to help the participant and the clinician or practitioner track when something is getting aggravated or getting better. Also with beliefs, for example, potentially even if someone doesn't expect a belief to change every day, but that they expect that it might change at some point in the next few months, that could be something to track when exactly some type of belief would be changing. But a lot of what is done in psychology research is it's for research questions that are about fluctuations or patterns. So for example, with emotions, that emotions are a concept in psychology that we expect to vary a lot in time. And so even to just look at one emotion and to track trajectories of that emotion, what is the typical either length of time or type of trajectory is a research question that a lot of people are looking at with ESM. Also interactions between different variables. So how might emotions be linked with, for example, interactions with different types of people, or many other types of interactions, but that to look at a more finely grained approach, so really from day to day or within a day, versus looking at something broader, so maybe instead of looking once a year, just at cross-sectional questionnaires. And another big question is, how does context change maybe specific emotions or experiences? So that was kind of that very first questionnaire from the 1970s. That was the kind of research question that they had. How do teenagers' moods and focus change depending on what type of sportive context they're in? And that's still a very common way of looking at or using ESM data as well, especially if you know that participants will be in specific contexts that you're interested in. So I'll talk now a lot more about self-report data specifically, because that is the main type of data in psychology that we use for ESM, and it's very different from more traditional questionnaires. So a traditional questionnaire, usually it's something that participants will respond to once, maybe a few times for typical longitudinal data, so maybe 2, 3, 4 times, but usually the idea is to measure something that you assume is not going to be changing that much over time. Whereas for this type of intensive longitudinal data, you're expecting participants to answer it many times, so usually many times a day over a few weeks. So that goes usually with the idea that a traditional questionnaire, it's looking at something that's maybe a trait or something that's a relatively static characteristic of a person. Whereas usually with ESM or intensive longitudinal data in psychology, we're looking at something that we assume is fluctuating over time, and that's why we choose this type of data. It doesn't always have to be that way, but that's one of the big cases of when people are using ESM. But because of that, for more traditional trait-type questionnaires, you would assume, or you would want your questionnaire to cover the whole spectrum. So if you're thinking of something like a depression or depressive symptoms questionnaire, you would want it to cover from people who have no depressive symptoms to people who have very severe symptoms. Similar with something maybe about attitudes, you would want to cover it about someone that has very distinct types of attitudes about one idea or one construct, because the point there is really to cover the whole spectrum or the whole range of a construct. Whereas, with intensive or longitudinal data or ESM, the idea instead is for all questions to be broadly applicable, not that extreme. So for example, in my own research, I was really measuring parenting behaviors. And a traditional questionnaire will have an item for more like abusive behaviors towards children, something like I hit my child with a hairbrush. And that's a very extreme type of behavior that might cover one extreme end of the spectrum, but to ask parents every day if they hit their child with a hairbrush would be really ridiculous and also probably difficult for a lot of parents or annoying. So here the idea is to really have questions that it makes sense for parents to be answering most days, or for participants to be answering most days. It does depend on the research question, though. So again, if maybe you're tracking something like symptoms in a medical population, and you want to know if a more extreme type of symptom is appearing, you might have that still pop up on most questionnaires, but that it should then be something participants can easily not check or not answer. But overall, so with these long questionnaires, the focus is usually on retest reliability, so that there shouldn't be that much change in how a participant answers from one time to the next, because if there is, that usually means that the questionnaire is not well designed, if you're measuring this type of idea of a trait characteristic of someone. Whereas for most intensive longitudinal self-report data, the focus is really on minimizing burden, and you do expect there to be changes in how people are answering from one time to the next, because usually you're focused on measuring fluctuations. But that in general, because you're asking people to take so much time out of their daily life for this, you really want very brief questions that are really focused on minimizing the burden for participants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about developing these types of self-report questionnaires. And that's a very different type of questionnaire development that, at least in traditional psychology cross-sectional questionnaires, is used. So first is checking if there are other similar items that are already geared towards being used every day or multiple times a day. There's a nice repository that is tracking this, that has a website online, so you can check for different constructs. It is from psychology, so most of these will be probably oriented more towards psychology, but that exists, and people can then also submit their own items if they've done some type of data collection, usually with some more information about either a publication or information about the sample and results from it. But you can also adapt items from traditional questionnaires. This might not be that straightforward, because there's a lot of items, if you're expecting something to not change over time, they just don't work in a setting where you're going to be asking people every day, but it could be a form of brainstorming, and also just brainstorming new items. Very importantly, you should be getting a lot of feedback from your target population and from experts. So for example, with my items, is I just had a number of parents read the items first and just give me any feedback on if they thought it was worded weirdly, if they understood it. Also, I told them what I was trying to assess with the items, and if they thought that it made sense to assess it that way or not. Similarly, for experts, would give me that type of feedback. I heard about this strategy a few months ago, and I thought it was really interesting, so I also put some references for it. A lot of questionnaire development in general for intensive longitudinal data, there's not that many references yet. There's more coming out, but this is a technique that is also used in traditional cross-sectional questionnaire development. So think aloud or cognitive interviewing. And this is the idea that you test out your questionnaire with your target population, where you have them answer the questionnaire, but verbalize everything they're thinking of as they answer it. So if it's a question about how exhausted they felt that day, you might have them think through their process. So maybe it'll be like, oh, well, am I thinking of when I started in the morning, or like now I'm a lot better, I'm not that exhausted anymore. Whatever their verbal process is of, or whatever their cognitive process of answering the question is, you try to have them verbalize it. And that really helps get an idea of if the items are actually targeting the constructs that you expect them to, and also maybe if there's different ways to interpret the items. And also sometimes participants will answer differently than they say aloud. So you can get an idea then if there's these types of questions that are maybe more lead towards that, where there's some kind of disconnect happening between the cognitive process and the actual response. And also essential is that there should be a lot of piloting. This is also just to make sure that it's not burdensome for parents. So I did for participants. So I did this with my sample of parents, where I had a small sample of maybe 5 parents just answer the questions twice a day and then once a day. And so, for example, they told me twice a day was ridiculous. They weren't seeing their kids usually that much in the morning, and also it was just more difficult. They also told me some items that they just found really annoying. So it's a way to get your final sample items that are not going to be something they find really frustrating or a time frequency that they find really annoying. Also, if you are interested in measuring fluctuations, then in piloting, you can already see if there is variance for different items or if participants are really answering the same way over time. So that can also be a way to select items. And so I wrote up how I did this with my specific sample with parents. And I also shared a spreadsheet of the whole process of the items. So I started out with 80, I think, items that I brainstormed, and then have tracked how I was winnowing down items. The main addition to what I've written here was that I also translated and back-translated the items from, I think we developed them in French and then translated them to English. And that was really interesting because we also realized in that process that there was some language things that were a bit vague that we didn't realize until we were actually translating them and had difficulty coming up with a specific term. So for this type of data, so if you're really having participants answer questions many times a day, there's a few main types of study designs. So one type is signal contingent. So this is really where participants are getting prompted at specific times. And that's this prompt is linked with the time. So this could be something fixed, where, for example, you're going to prompt the participants 10 times a day, and you're going to be, okay, I'm going to prompt you every 2 hours to answer some questions. It could be something random, so maybe just completely randomly at 10 times of the day, or semi-random to be sure that you're getting different parts of the day, maybe a random time within 2 hours or something like that. You could also have it be event contingent, and so this is where the participant themselves is going into the app or onto a web page and is answering questions after something happens, so after an event happens. So this could be, for example, after a social interaction, after eating, after smoking. These are main examples from psychology research. And so this can be really nice for participants in the sense that it can be less of a burden. They're not getting these prompts all the time in their daily life, but then you're also relying on the participant to remember after these events have happened to go in and to answer questions. Both do tend to work pretty well. Both do also require a lot of briefing and talking with participants before the study starts to make sure the participants really understand. And so mainly it comes down to what your research question is. And another main study design, which is a bit newer, is to have higher density prompts after either a specific event happens or after maybe a threshold is reached. So basically, say suddenly they're answering about different emotions, and suddenly they're answering more intensely than they were before. Maybe a higher value, some threshold is crossed, and then you want to track how their emotions are changing right after that. And especially something with emotions or other variables that you expect to change faster than over a few hours, you might want to prompt them every 10 minutes or every few minutes. But that would be ridiculous to do that throughout the day, and so you just focus it after specific events that you're interested in. So that's a newer type of study design where there are already some analytical methods that are being developed or tested for it, but it can be really interesting for variables or for concepts, constructs that you expect to change more quickly than every few hours. So especially in psychology, that's emotions, for example. And then for participants' responses, so this is something where it's asking a lot of participants to do this type of thing. So it's really important that they're engaged and that they feel like they're a part of the research. So I put here, I think it's a preprint, but that someone really went through the different things they tried to engage adolescents. It has some really fun ideas where, for example, they had memes at the end of every week that the participants could see, but only maybe if they answered a certain number of questions. And they mentioned that the participants only found that useful and motivating if the memes were actually funny. And so they had to get like a younger sample to create the meme so that it would match. So that it has to be targeted to what your sample is. So with adolescents, it's going to be something very different, maybe definitely than adults, but also than other types of samples. It's also important participants are taking their time, if it's possible, to compensate them financially. That's always really nice, especially since these are pretty burdensome studies. A lot of participants do like getting feedback, so it could maybe be the data itself or some type of summary data. It could just be average levels or how things have changed over time. But a lot of participants find that something very useful and something that they're motivated by. Also, to have personalized contact with the participants so that participants know who the researchers are, that they're having some kind of briefing at the beginning, that they understand kind of what the goal, it doesn't have to be the exact goal of the study is, but that they're contributing to this research project in some way. And so especially with this type of really intensive data, it really helps to have this kind of different ways to engage participants so that they stay through the whole study. So now, once you have this type of really intensive data, especially if it's quantitative data, so you're having all of these time points with different numbers, pre-processing is really important. So basically to get an idea first of if you have anything weird in your data, if you expect it to be every day, but it's actually, the dates are not what you expect them to be, or they're shifted, or you're missing a bunch of values. So I have a colleague who put together a ESM pre-processing gallery, where it's a website online, but it's also an R package to help researchers look through their data in a very, to look at many different considerations or parts of their data to make sure that it's as they would expect it to be. So some examples here are looking at if there's any duplicate time points, checking and missingness in different ways, looking at time. Usually you have to do different things with the time variable to put it into a format that you can then use in R or in another software, and that can be something that can easily go wrong. So it's helping you check that transformations are also going as you expect. Also looking at different things like how soon the participant answered the questionnaires. So if it was right away, if it was longer, how long they took to answer, these types of things which can give just general insight into the data that you have. So that's a nice resource if anyone will be working with this type of data. And then for the types of analyses, so I'm not going to go in depth into anything, but I will point you to some places to look for more information. But this can be something very, very simple, so really just looking at descriptives. Usually if you're collecting this type of data, by descriptives, by the way, I mean, for example, averages, standard deviation, correlations. But usually if you're looking at this type of data, if you're collecting it, it's because you want to do something that's a bit more complex, because especially if you're looking just at averages, you can also, there is still some use for it, maybe to comparing to see if variables are changing over time or if they're relatively stable, or comparing it to cross-sectional questionnaires. But overall, if you're asking participants to go through all this effort, usually you're going to be doing something a little bit more complex. So one very simple thing is just to start adding time into models. So this can be just the observation number or something like that, so that you're having an idea of how something is evolving over time. You can also use different types of multi-level mixed models if you have many participants. So this can be where basically you're looking at how different things are evolving over time, but taking into account that you have many participants and that they're not behaviors, but their responses are probably a bit similar in some way. You can also do analyses just on one person. There's a specific data set in psychology, which was one person who answered about their mood 4 times a day for, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years. And it was someone who had depression, who went through a remission of depression, and then the symptoms got worse again. And so that is a data set that a lot of people have looked at because it's very interesting, but also it's such rich time data that it goes on for so long. So you could also just look at one person, but a lot of data sets here, or a lot of research questions, is usually looking at multiple people and also tracking if there's differences between people, or looking overall what is common between people in different trajectories or patterns. And you can also use models that are more specifically for time series data. So these are usually adapted in some way from econometrics or other fields that are focused really on time series. So there's a lot of literature also in psychology on autoregressive models. So this is the idea just that you have a lagged relationship from the previous time point to now, so that whatever the person responded at the previous time point is going to influence how they're answering something right now. And this is a parameter that can be put into most models, and is one way that people will incorporate how time is impacting responses. Some other things that people are doing are using a moving window response. So this is just where you're looking at maybe 10 time points at once and then moving the window over. It's less used in a lot of psychology research, but I've heard that it's used in some medical research with ESM data to track how things are evolving over time. And I personally find it really interesting to pre-register different parts of this whole process. So from the data collection part, so if you have decided on how you'll recruit your sample beforehand, how you'll, when you'll stop your data collection, these types of things, but also on specifics of the analyses, if you have an idea of what kind of analysis you want to do, and to pre-register the specific model or other types of other aspects of your analysis. And this is something that can change, so that maybe you realize that it doesn't work anymore, or it's not aligning with your research question as it's evolving or something. But that, to me, it's really helpful to have kind of the pattern, not the pattern, but the idea laid out from the beginning, to do a lot of research at the start. And especially for me as an earlier career researcher, it helped me a lot to have a better idea before I was starting out with what I wanted to go towards. So there's a template that a group has put up on OSF specifically for pre-registering ESM data collection. So this is more from a psychology background again, but it gives some ideas of the information they find really interesting to pre-register about data collection, pre-processing, and analysis. And then I've also put an example from one of my studies that I pre-registered, and I think that I also did end up changing aspects, and then I would just put in the paper that in a footnote or in a specific paragraph what I changed and why from the pre-registration. So these are two really useful books. The first one, it's a free book that covers broadly from coming up with the research question, data collection, analyses. And in their analyses chapters, they also do reference other useful articles. And I have read a good amount of that book, and it was very interesting and useful as an introduction. And the one on for y'all, the right, it's more focused on mental health research, but in general, it's very helpful, especially when designing a study for a population that might be harder to reach, or that might be harder for the population to answer the questions all the time. So, for example, they did some studies with psychotic patients where they discussed ways that to get the participants engaged, to get them answering a good number of questions, and so on. So that was really interesting. In my case, thinking of, I worked with exhausted parents or burned out parents, but also in general for harder to reach populations to get ideas from what they thought up. So for some main takeaways, if there are research questions about time, about how something is evolving, one option is to look at intensive longitudinal data. This could be something where you look at data that's already collected, even things like archival data with diaries, but it could be really that you are asking participants to fill out questionnaires or to write or record something every day. So this is especially to track things that you expect maybe to fluctuate or to change over time in a specific pattern. But it is important to balance, is the burden for participants, if you are getting participants to answer these questions or these prompts, is it worth all of this for the participants? And I really talked about a few main types of data, usually self-report data from participants that was quantitative. But the data types in some sense are pretty endless. As you could see from my slide where I talked about active and passive types, it's really just the idea that there are data that's really finely grained in time and how to look at that and how to treat it. So a lot of what I have presented is really from the psychology background, but there are, in a lot of other fields as well, other ways to treat the data, especially maybe more passive collected data. But with this type of data, there is a lot of potential for it to burden participants, especially if they're answering these questions every day. One way to reduce the burden is to, for example, have some kind of passive sensing. I even have colleagues at KU Leuven that are thinking of looking at participants' phone usage and only prompting them when they think the participants are, for example, in distress, based on what the participants are looking at on their phone. But then you have questions of intrusiveness. And so that's just conversations to have also with the participants, especially if there is some kind of passive sensing going on, what the participants feel comfortable with. And there's also the question of relevance, so that usually for participants not to be too frustrated, these questions should be something that is a bit relevant to their lives, that they find interesting to answer or to get some kind of feedback or summary at the end of what they have answered. And also that, of course, the data should be relevant to the research question, especially since it is something that's so intensive for the participants in many ways. And so I really do see these slides as kind of a bit of an introduction with different references and resources. So I'm going to have the QR code again right here. And I did put my email as well. So if you have questions later, you're welcome to email me. And if you have any questions now, I'm really happy to answer them as well. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Yeah. Do you mind taking a mic?
I don't mind, but I think...
They want it for the camera. If not, I can rephrase it if you prefer.
Yeah, I just love your presentation. It was really insightful.
Thank you.
And I am wondering, how did you handle to get participants involved for this such an intensive study? So you talked about having the compensation and gathering feedback for participants. How did you do that on your study?
So for me, I ended up recruiting a lot in online spaces. I also did put a lot of posters. So I was recruiting parents, and partly parents from the general population, so just general parents, but also parents who felt exhausted or burned out. And so I did put a lot of posters in doctors' waiting rooms and different types of areas like that where parents would go at different times, but a lot of it was also in online spaces. A particularity of my data collection was that it happened during COVID lockdowns. So I think the online spaces, it was like Facebook pages for parents in the area and different things like that. Those were very useful. I'm sure that I got a specific sample in the sense that these were parents who were interested in taking part in this data collection. I did compensate them, but it wasn't enough that that would be the sole motivator to take part in a 2-month study where they were answering a bunch of questions every day. And what I had found is actually, in my case, a lot of the parents were really interested just in having someone record and take note of their experiences. Part of that was definitely that it was happening during the lockdown, and so for all parents, suddenly it was a much more difficult time, and a lot of them told me that they felt like they weren't able to really communicate their experiences other than maybe to their friends, but that they felt like it was a much more difficult time and other people weren't really interested in hearing that. But I think in general, there's a lot of people who themselves now in their daily lives are tracking different things, maybe with some kind of Apple Watch or with apps on their phone. And so I think there are a lot of people who are interested also if that can be shared for research questions. It's just how to find those people that would be interested in this. And that sometimes still can be difficult to find. And for me, I think it would be really interesting, for example, if some of the companies that make the wearable devices, I don't know if any of you have heard of Whoop, But that's something that I have people in my life that have. So it's a wearable device that tracks different like heart rate variability and movement and things like that. And also it has questionnaires that people are answering about what they're doing in their day. So it really is this type of data, but it's not data that's, right now at least, can be shared with researchers. It only just started being able to be shared with the person themselves, the raw data. But to me, there's a lot of people that are already interested themselves in this type of data, or maybe already collecting it. So I think it's just finding people that are interested in it. I think the harder part is if for some reason you're interested in a population that would not want to collect this type of data, and that I think would be really difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, again, thank you very much for your presentation. As a follow-up question, and I already told you that I'm a survey researcher, so have you looked into the bias that you had in your parents' sample? I mean, do you have some sort of benchmark? And on a more general note, regarding the question on incentivizing people, do you have some experience to share with us? What other types of incentives could be? I mean, you said money, of course. You also said sharing the results with the participants could be rewarding. So any comments on that?
So for the bias sample, so especially in my case, I am sure that it was a specific population, just in the sense that the people that contacted me were baseline interested, and it's a pretty intensive study. And that, of course, I don't know who did not contact me. But we did look at a variety of variables that I was interested in for my study, so things about burnout, about depression, about anxiety, and maybe a few other parenting questionnaires, just to make sure that it was an overall, like that the sample spanned the entire spectrum, and we did get that. So I did also have in my sample of parents in burnout, parents that were very extremely burned out. But for those specific populations, for parents in burnout, I had actually recruited through clinicians. So I had reached out to different clinicians in Belgium that were specifically working with parents in burnout, and said if they thought that they had participants or patients who might be interested, that they could talk about it with their patients. And part of the reason I had done that is I also didn't want to overburden participants. So these were participants that were already seeing some kind of therapist or clinician, so they already had some type of support. So at least I don't think that there was at least all spans of these different variables represented, but that, again, it still is a specific sample. As for the other question, about engagement.
Yeah, incentivizing people, engagement, yeah.
So I recently went to a kind of like informal conference where we had a like hackathon about this, and it was really interesting hearing all of the different types of strategies, but most of them did boil down to some kind of incentive. It didn't have to be financial, of course. Incentive in the sense of like maybe money or a gift card or something else that's relevant to their context. To personal contact with the researcher and feeling like, so that the person really feels invested in the research project and understands that their responses are important for the final knowledge that's being generated. Usually some type of, again, feedback. Other ideas, though, that were thrown out, one that is very popular is the idea of gamification, so that participants are just interested in answering the questions. Maybe they're competing against others, maybe they're competing against themselves, but there's something like that. But that was discussed a lot, where it probably would only be useful in certain populations, and even the types of gamifications would be really important, where if it is competing against others, some people would just not find that at all interesting. But that is something that is kind of actively being researched as a method to engage participants right now, especially in these types of studies.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief response.
Yeah.
I mean, providing feedback also could create some sort of feedback loop and changing behavior and stuff like that. So this, I know that is interesting, and I know that participants might be interested in these kind of information, but it could change their behavior in the future, and but potentially for other researchers who are interested in collecting this type of data. And I also wanted to ask, were anyone able to download the slides? Because I was unable to do so, but I will send you an email. So,
Yeah.
okay, thank you again.
Real quick for the part about changing behavior. So there are even some studies that have this like at the end of every week, and they have not found a big change in behavior. But also, this is something that is intrinsic a bit to the idea of, especially if people are reporting about their own behaviors or experiences, that they're getting a new awareness. Usually they're thinking more about what they're doing, and so there is some type of change over time that's occurring in any case. And for most of these studies, we consider that it's not a big enough problem. And in my case, for example, I had parents told me that they appreciated answering these questions because it made them reflect every day. And in my case, I was like, as long as it's not something that's harmful for the parents, I'm okay if there's change that's happening. But that it is likely with these types of data collections, there is going to be change in how the participants are responding and are behaving over time, just by the nature of the data collection. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who's also collecting panel data, we know panel conditioning, so this happens all the time. Just wanted to mention it.
Yeah.
Again, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we have like a few more minutes if there is one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It has been very interesting, and I have a lot of questions and a lot of notes. Maybe I will focus on a couple of points. I am interested in critical data studies, so how actually our methods or how we think about and implement data collection speaks about our conceptual framework and how we look at reality. And while I was listening to you, I kept asking myself, I kept asking how many interviewees you have, because probably the sample, I assume, might not be so big.
Yes.
And although systematization and a higher level of abstraction is important when working with intensive data or rich data, why or what made you think that this kind of approach would work better than qualitative in-depth interviews, for instance? Because how you presented it, it's yes, a questionnaire that people have to fill in many times a day or a couple of times a day, or as many times as needed. But it looked to me also as a sort of ethnographic diary, because they recorded events, emotions, what happened. So if you, I would appreciate if you could tell how you decided for this intensive data collection as compared to the qualitative data, and also related to what others have said. Indeed, I was also interested in the motivation of the interviewees, why they would do that, and I also wanted to ask you if you are organizing or will organize some sort of restitution, some moments of where you can present your research and see what you have learned.
So I'll answer quickly because the time's almost up, but I'm also happy to talk more after if you would like. For the restitution, so I did have immediately after the study a debriefing with each participant that was just a few minutes, or however long the participant wanted, but usually it was a few minutes long, to tell me if they wanted information about the final results for the entire sample, and to tell me if they had any problems or any other comments or things that they liked about the study. And I think maybe half the sample wanted information about the final results. So then I had sent, it wasn't a call, it was a summarized text that I had sent to them about the results, and then if they wanted more information that they could contact me and we could have a call. So that was the type of restitution that we had. For the first question, the very brief answer would be that the main reason people like this method, compared to especially interviews, is that there's no recall bias. And so, especially with something like emotions, that there is the assumption that what people remember is maybe different from what actually happened, and that this is in their everyday life, and so you don't have that aspect of memory. A lot of the questions, it depends on who's doing the research, but a lot of questions are really what's happening right now for you. Some of the ways people are doing it now is maybe getting a bit further from that, but that's kind of the big reason people do this, as well as maybe there's associations or things that are happening that participants might not realize. So for example, with their emotions, how quickly the emotions are fading or how they're changing. But it's a big question. And for myself, I also collected qualitative data from participants, and that's something that I'm also analyzing now to see what the differences are, and that I'll be presenting about tomorrow because as a work in progress, because I have a lot of questions about it. So it's an open thing. And I think it is now, 1 minute late, so we will stop. And thank you very much, everybody. And feel free if you have more questions.